Before we go to the panel discussion and keep your intriguing questions right now to yourselves, you can ask this all, hopefully, during the panel. And we will first dive into some of the cool stuff that Roland will talk about. And Roland, there's only one thing I have to say about him. His and Laura Linsi's artwork is on my home wall, and I'm really glad about it because it's a beautiful piece of art. That is not something he will talk about, but we'll hear what he'll talk about. So the stage is yours.
Thank you. I wanted to first congratulate the organizers of this event. It's an amazing event and amazing speakers, and obviously the people who came to see and hear. And it's a shame that more people couldn't even fit maybe in this room. My name is Roland. I'm an architect. I graduated in TU Delft in the Netherlands, and then I kept on working there for a couple of years and kept on teaching in TU Delft. And then for the past 7 years, I've been living in London, mostly in the UK. But since there's a lot of contacts and people professionally and also in my personal life in Estonia, I often come here, obviously. And I share a project or a practice with Laura, where we started off doing a lot of exhibitions and installation works, and gradually as well we have smaller commissions and projects, and we're very keen on natural building materials and in general about material flows. So this has led us to teaching and quite a bit of consultancy work as well. And I wanted to say actually that the exhibitions have been quite interesting. Like for me, like some people ask me, like, you know, why are you doing all these exhibitions? To me, exhibitions are really like little models of material flows. They are like little testing grounds because you have an input of materials, you have something that needs to happen and finish, and then you're gonna have output of materials. So they're actually really good grounds to understand material inputs and outputs in terms of flows and labor and time that goes into building them. I want to focus on a teaching project that we've been doing now for some years in London. So I will try to kind of bridge my UK experience with what I'm maybe seeing in Estonia as well. And the project that we're kind of collaborating with the local council in UK is a big master plan, which is developed by a local council. It's called the Meridian Water Master Plan. What is interesting about it is that the client is the council itself, which is very outstanding. It's a huge brownfield sort of industrial site in London, and it has very high aims about offering 10,000 new housing units, out of which 40% is affordable housing, with very high environmental aims, obviously because of the client itself is a council. And I wanted to really focus or also be very clear about this 40% of affordable housing, and also a little bit to give a bit of context to maybe people from abroad as well, that in Estonia, there are no regulations to provide affordable housing. So when we talk about real estate development here, we talk about free market, full on max. Like, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong later, but I find it a very crucial thing that is absolutely missing here in Estonia. But maybe I'll turn that later on as well. And the way for such a big project to actually take place is that obviously there's a strategic London master plan that gives up guidances in how to actually procure this sort of a massive project. The city actually gives out specific guidances in how to deal with, for example, circular materials, to which the council or the developer needs to respond. So you have the master plan, the guidances, and the response from the developer, obviously. I don't know if we like peek into some of those documents. That, you know, it really depends how big the project is. But if we peek into some of them, in some pages, for example, if you have a circular economy guidance, then there is a whole set of kind of question trees or questionnaires in how do you imagine that if a project is being built, what kind of layers do you imagine? How do you imagine to reuse them? What kind of layers are they built out of so that you could also unbuild them later on in the future? And there are also, you know, clear guidances in using LCA calculations, for example, which I hope, or I assume a lot of you maybe know. I mean, the bigger the project, the more precise it needs to be. But also, when I kind of try to link with Estonia, that because these big master plans, they take a lot of time. So, 10, 20, 30 years maybe. There are also guidances in how to actually carry out the meanwhile processes. So you have a construction site and or next to it, it's a big empty site. So how do you actually do meanwhile use so that it actually starts to serve bigger public goods? There are even like example economical models in how to bring maybe people together. There's something that I worked on a little bit as well. For example, in London, it was like a small kiosk. We were granted a 10-year permission. I was working for a practice, Saint Architects. We were granted a 10-year rent, which meant that we couldn't use, for example, foundations, but we could really experiment, They were like kind of, the council was happy for us to, play around with drainage rings and kind of fool around a little bit and turn this place something alive. And I think this is something that we could also learn from when you look at, around in Estonia. Mostly when you have empty plots or vacant sites in Tallinn, they are unfortunately parking lots. And obviously, when you have the developer developing such a big area, they need to respond to, how do they plan to implement all these ideas in stages, but also the kind of social, let's say, aims, for example, how much affordable housing they should include, and also carbon positive, principles. And this is actually where we kind of come in a little bit. If you have a very big area, then the developer also needs to provide or show that there is a willing to collaborate with wider institutions or innovative projects to include more people than only developers or contractors. So we were actually approached by the council when we were teaching in Central Saint Martins. We still are teaching there. With a very simple aim that what the council had been doing or setting up for a while is a material bank of these buildings that will be actually disassembled or demolished or taken down in this area. So it's an area full of old warehouses. This is online right now. You can check it out. It's a kind of a functioning, kind of a beta project, thing on a pilot, trying to test out, trying it also on the clients, etc. But more importantly, what we were invited to was also to participate in these sort of, in improving or being part of this discussion. So as a public, party, a council, what they did is they're still doing it. They are weekly, every Friday, there are these sort of forums about material circles or material cycling. And it is very interesting because we have, on the site, we have those donor projects, so possibly buildings that will be dismantled or demolished. So every week there would be different kinds of experts from engineers, potential clients, architects, but also, for example, lawyers who know material cycles or waste department centers. And there's this sort of live Miro board, and there are online meetings where we would like kind of shuffle things around and everybody gives comments. So actually, the project is not so much of the software, maybe, it is much more about also pooling people together, trying to map the current situation in. And the council had also ordered some audits on disassembly audits, which we are now talking about quite a lot. So rather than demolishing, we need to aim to how to disassemble buildings, to take them down neatly. And furthermore, I think it was a really good grounds to discuss some critical topics as well. Like what are the limits of the LCA calculations, for example, right now, life cycle assessments, because there are issues and there have been bad precedents in London, for example, where, if you are a big developer, you have a big budget, you can kind of tweak the numbers. Whereas, for example, as a council who has less, let's say, knowledge and skill and a budget to counteract, then the council is actually in a poor condition. And there are bad precedents where old buildings have been taken down because even against the community who was actually fighting to keep them. So these things were discussed quite critically, or things like carbon tunnel vision in terms of when we are we're really funneled into talking about like these carbon emissions, whereas actually we need to also focus on wider topics such as inequality or housing rights, etc. Or even like more kind of as a very British thing, I feel like. But has anybody heard of Jevons paradox? Yeah? Okay, that's good. I mean, I saw a few hands. But I find it a very helpful tool to kind of reset your mind a bit. Jevons paradox is coming from the industrial era when William Jevons, an economist, what he noticed is that the more efficiently we dig coal, actually the more we start to use it. So the efficiency actually doesn't lower the use of it, it actually increases it, which is kind of helpful to when we think about, for example, reusing materials, or what happens if we start to actually demolish buildings because we can gain more out of it, which is almost a question of preservation, like what do we need to preserve in the future in terms of architecture. And kind of with the students, you know, this is perfect grounds. Like we have every year around 20 students in London, and these are, they are second and third year students. You know, they pretty much just like started the school almost. And we could visit those sites. This is us in one of those buildings. And by the end of the year, one of them was disassembled, the other one was demolished, for example. So we could see the process, we see live projects in front of us. We ask students to do their own material mapping to really understand what they are actually seeing in there, what kind of qualities they see in random stuff like cladding, for example. And we work with models, these sort of like fragment models, to test out some ideas. And it's kind of fun as well, you know, for the students. And for me as well, I think the first brief that we actually give them is not to build something, not to design something, but they need to take things apart. They need to unmake things. And this is such a skill that we see in the future is necessary. You know, if you have a steel construction, which during the time when we started the studio, the Ukrainian crisis sort of, let's say, totally went bust and like, you know, increased a lot, and the price of steel went super high. So actually it was a very, very good time in order to talk about the cost of steel as well. And, you know, do you weld or do you bolt? Like, what do you do? How do you take apart a building that is welded or bolted? You know, as a second year student, it's kind of a funny thing to think that this is what you came for architecture for, you know, I don't know. Or brick wall where the mortar is stronger than the brick itself. And if you take it apart, it just becomes this sort of jumble of stuff, you know. But then I really enjoy this sort of naive creativity also by the students, you know, like we always ask them to work in like kind of fragments, like not to think of a holistic concept from the beginning, but rather start thinking about details. So you bring two materials together and you start to imagine what they could be. So there's a lot of discussion about aesthetics, but also the sustainability or demounting or disassembly also for future use. So we kind of took this knowledge that we have from the UK, and we wanted to kind of test it in Estonia as well. We were invited by the museum director of the Architecture Museum to do an exhibition, which we called Urban Stocks, and we translated into linnamaardla, which we, there wasn't a really good word for it, like urban mining or urban stocks. So we kind of invented this word, linnamaardla. And for us as well, it was, you know, we wanted to kind of, through our bodies, through our kind of embodied experience, we wanted to just jump into it, you know, straight into seeing where would the materials take us to. And it's not these materials, again, similar to what I explained earlier. It's about that these materials took us to different places. You know, it took us to waste departments. It took us to the city gardeners because they have quite a lot of leftovers or fallen trees, for example. So it took us to all different parties who are involved in dealing with the circularity or moving of material flows. And we did this exhibition with columns of different reused materials and sort of almost like a cathedral of these materials that later on were taken up or disassembled and then sent off further on. So it was like, for a brief moment, these materials came, somehow they came together as material knots, and then they went their way again. So it was almost like a little stopping point for materials. But like in hindsight now, we did this last year, and the more important thing for me definitely was actually to bring together these different parties who are involved in these topics, in Estonia particularly. As an exhibition, for me, this was called, I would call it like a one project, because you might see enthusiasts working here and there, but seeing it as a coherent one project and presenting it to the public as such, to me, was very important. And so we held these, like, for example, a seminar where we invited people who are working in the similar fields. And everybody was also, we had an LCA expert there, a calculator, an engineer, architects. And to me, my takeaway was that everybody was pointing towards the government or the public authorities, that they should lead the way. Because the problem is that Tallinn doesn't have much of land that they can kind of, there's no stronghold how to kind of deal with developers. What Tallinn has, or what Estonia has, is RKS, for example. It's a governmental body who holds a lot of portfolio of buildings that are old and new, and that they should lead the way. And that would be an interesting topic to discuss later on in the panel as well. But there were really interesting, projects that kind of, for me, I was really glad to see them almost like one project, like Kuidas Works, who are dealing with how to use soil that is coming from underneath the construction sites. All the Tallinn Technical University, who are looking at how to recycle silicate bricks, because that's the largest amount of empty buildings, vacant buildings that we have in eastern Estonia. And so we wrote also like a couple of articles, and also Sven is here as well, and Kaupo, for example, as well. So Sven called me in the beginning of the year, and he said, I read this article that you wrote, and like, I really want to do this thing, but I'm coming from an IT background, let's do it. Or he was already, kind of working on it, I guess. And I'm really happy to see that actually this is kind of, it's a student project for now, but it is kind of an urban mining bank in a way. It is a way to map or understand, do audits of existing buildings in order to see if they could be potentially reused later. And I guess I understand that there might be potential projects already that this could be tested. They already had a cap, it's crazy. I mean, I don't have a cap. But I mean, to me, these are really like small steps, but this is where we start from. And I think these small steps are somehow very important, I feel like, in the region as well. What is very specific, I feel like, we can also talk about it later, in the Baltics, is that it's a vast terrain with very little population. So I can drive from here to the border of Poland, and I will see 3 times less people than in London. Baltics is about 6.4 million people. So it also means that there is way less competition. And usually competition is something that thrives, it pushes each other. We have like 2 competing companies, who would win it? We don't have it much. And actually, when we also talked to Sven last week, and we said that the merit of this is that it needs to be based on collaboration, at least and in this early stage. You can't roll out this project as a business yet. It needs people to be involved. You need to pull people together, because otherwise that doesn't sell, And I feel like, again, the software for me, for example, is rather a tool and a device to involve other people. And then obviously the Excel sheets, they produce with AI nowadays. I don't even know. But I think this is something that is very specific to this area as well. So this was maybe the first part of the talk, and I'll enter to the second part of the talk, where I want to zoom out a little bit, because my task here was also to a little bit provoke or introduce some ideas, or kind of lead in the panel talk as well. And I've titled it Entangled, how we are entangled in this sort of world of materials and social aspects, etc. And I actually do need to, like every year when the school starts, I need to almost like refresh myself as well. Like how do you approach students who for the first time maybe they are starting to think about these topics? And one of the words that I come across the most often these days, and I heard it also today, is ecology. We talk so much about ecology. And people ask me like, oh, are you doing this eco house? And I'm like, what do you mean by that? And I quite enjoy relying on this, one of the earliest definitions of ecology. It was devised by this biologist or zoologist, Ernst Haeckel, in the 19th century. And he said ecology is a relationship between living organisms and environments. It's as simple as that. I mean, he was also a person who did those beautiful drawings, but they were never really accurate because he was also a bit of a romanticist, so he always drew them a little bit nicer than they actually were in reality. But I think this idea of, what is an eco-house? Like, what is this word even? And to me, an eco-house is that you've designed something consciously thinking about other species and their environments. It's as simple as that. And while ecology is like a kind of a mess, this is how I drew. This is how I think ecology looks like, It's sort of like a kind of a blobby stuff. But ecosystem is something that we are fully scientifically aware of. When in ecology we are always like exploring or discovering new species, then ecosystem is something that we are modeling, and we are conscious of its sort of boundaries and borders. And one of the best boundary sort of systems that I've come across is the planetary boundaries. If you're not aware of it, I really recommend you to look it up, which defines sort of 9 key areas where how the planet is in balance. So, for example, one of the areas is land use. How land use has changed over time so much, either through urbanization or agriculture. Or the other major topic, for example, at the moment is ocean acidification. We will see with global warming that oceans will be they can't take any more of the heat. They will start to, at one moment, release the heat, which is an irreversible process. So these are the boundaries that we are kind of working with. And then in the middle, we have economy. I have no idea how economy looks like, so I drew it as a letter E, but a bit of like a fatty one. And to me, economy, I also rely on one of the earlier one of the initial original words. It's oikos or oikonomia, or it comes from Greek, meaning it's a household. And it is definitely smaller than the ecology itself, because a household is a human affairs. It doesn't rely, it's really about like humans sharing their information, and other species are directly not involved with it. And maybe the letter E is actually not so bad, because E is also, of course, empires, and this is where colonial era started from, where the global trades and material goods started to travel all around the world. I really recommend you to watch lectures or read her book, Jane Hutton, who's written about stories of material movements and how materials and construction materials are involved with global trades. And it's still happening. We are still obviously in the kind of global chains of material movements. Sand is the most used construction material in the world. Not only construction, it's also in technology and glass, etc. And the United Nations obviously has kind of written very thorough reports how the scarcity of sand has actually led to also a lot of illegal businesses, but also almost like sand mafia, as you might call. There's even a film called Sand Wars that looks into this sort of the most simplest material in the world and how we kind of just move it around. And we can call them externalities. In economy, you call externality a resource that you don't calculate within your household. So you have this as almost like a gift, and you kind of play around with. But it's not really put into your budget. It's just sort of almost like a gift from somewhere, from nature, I guess. And we don't really need to look too far, maybe. We can be very proud of timber industry in Estonia, but if all this sort of, the timber that is prepared for construction, if it comes from energy that is not clean, then obviously we can call it an externality. We don't put this into the calculation. And Estonia has major issues with coal mining. So these sort of externalities or quarries or places that you kind of take things, they're all kind of feeding the economy in one direction, meaning it is also, part of the extractivist world. Extractivist meaning that, you take things, but you don't give the things in return. So it is a one-way affair and movement of goods. And you can see some of those sort of resources. I don't know, this circle, for example, is kind of just at the border of ecosystem in a way. And that's exactly where where we're still pushing this sort of understanding of what a biodiversity is and where materials are coming from. And so there's a huge debate in Estonia about what is sustainable forestry. There are two parties, two different views. Some say that clearances make sense. The others say we are completely losing the biodiversity. So there are these two schools who are kind of trying to talk to each other, or they don't talk, they kind of debate with each other very hardly. So I'm quite interested actually that we've come to awareness that we have overconsumed the resources. So what do you do, or how do you deal with it? And one of the words that I've come across when reading a few texts quite often is regenerative. You could call it like regenerative design. And it's a word that actually comes from also agriculture, because the quality of soil has been degraded under heavy agriculture a lot, meaning that it can't bear anymore the nutrients or the plantage as well. So it becomes degraded. It becomes under very low quality. And regenerative means that we don't just simply need to restore it. We actually need to restore it to even a better condition than it was before. And actually, this has fed very clearly and directly into architecture as well. Like kind of working in the UK, or worked in a couple of practices and talking to colleagues as well. In 2019, a group of architects collectively called for a climate and biodiversity emergency, and they pledged to, they said that they will work towards a better future. What does it actually mean for a better future? More or less under 3 themes, for example, that they will focus more on circular and natural building materials. They will work on more biodiversity, but also they work on ethics and transparency of their offices. So earlier as well, when we talked about what a cooperative actually means, cooperative ideally is a much more transparent form of running a business or an enterprise. So this year as well, it was published as sort of a group of architects, or there was a report on what are these practices that these architects changed. What did they change in their practice? For example, many turned into cooperatives, or many focused on smaller projects that they could kind of handle more in a more delicate way. And then you have architects also who, write roadmaps within their practices so that they plan their actions and their kind of tick boxes, that with each project they go through what should be done in order to achieve a more regenerative design. And they publish on their websites, and you might ask in the end, like, why all this fuss, Why do they publish all these things? Like, they could just spend their time doing maybe better drawings or better buildings. But of course, the answer is very clear and simple, that the rest of the world, everything is going in that direction. And if you have competence in these areas as a professional architect or an engineer or a part of a public governmental office, if you have competence in it, then you will get the job. It's quite easy. Like in the England, for example, this year, I think they published this new law where if you're building a big development or a road or like a railway, the land that it takes up, that it takes away from nature, it should be replaced with a higher level of biodiversity than it was before. So these are quite complex tasks, actually. And when I think of in Estonia as well about Rail Baltica, etc., it's quite a major undertaking. So obviously there needs to be some sort of a shift in what the design means. And it should be more ecological, otherwise it's just more extractive. It's as easy as that. The trick is that there are 2 schools. There are the radicals who say, time's up. Doing less bad is not good enough. I really like the sentence, like, doing less bad is not good enough, which is written by a person who kind of came up with this idea of cradle to cradle. The problem is with radicals is that you need top-down mandates and strong political will to do that. Whereas the incrementalists say, you know, we need more time and research and trial and error, which kind of makes sense to me, obviously. But the problem is that if you're sitting in a wealthier position in Estonia, for example, where the global warming perhaps is not as evident, we are just too comfortable. You know, we're a bit lazy and we're too slow to take action. I guess you know maybe some radicals. I mean, this is Tom Woolley on the left. I did a natural building material course with him in Wales, and he hates petrochemicals. I mean, God, he hates petrochemicals. He hates Kingspan, Celotex. He hates passive house because you just need a lot of tape for it. You need a lot of foam that you put on the walls to simply keep your buildings warm. Or, for example, a radical example is also in Estonia when they try to push through this law to have 50% of new public housing made out of timber. And obviously it backlashes because other materials, other manufacturers need the same starting point. So you could call this trying out this sort of top-down view. And this is a democratic world and we all enjoy it. And, you know, it's quite evident why China is leading the green transition, and I wouldn't want to live there. So I guess the question is, like, how do you contribute to this regenerative shift? Like, maybe a question to you all, regardless of which sort of position you hold. Do you only work with existing buildings or biogenic materials? Or do you only work for ethical clients? Or do you change something in the office culture? Or maybe you're a denier? So I want to finish the talk with just a couple of key takeaways that I mentioned also earlier. I guess the most efficient building is not a building at all, most sustainable building. So I guess ideally we don't demolish so much anymore. It's all about adaptive reuse. But if we do reuse, we need to look at the durability of materials and develop new audit processes or practices. For the Baltic context, we have a lot of agriculture, and the byproduct of straw or hemp could be completely used, but at the moment it's very little used. Or we have a lot of coastline that has a lot of seasons, and reed goes seasonally. So we need to endorse biogenic materials. We could way more experiment with empty sites. And I don't know, I try to be polite but direct that we need to pressure more developers. Tallinn is the fastest segregating city in Estonia. Airbnbs still go crazy. Flats are bought up by Scandinavian pension funds. And to me, this is a huge problem. Like, if we don't deal with this now, then with climate refugees and the population might be growing, we're facing a huge issue here with housing. So you can put like windmills on the houses, but it doesn't solve the housing crisis. And this I find not to be sustainable at all. Thank you.